All right, here's our video today. Lipolysis, how fatty acids can make ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. And ATP is the energy molecule. It's the energy we need in our body. And there's many fuel sources to get ATP. So when glucose, and by the way, lipolysis, you see the first prefix there, lipids means fats. So we could say so that's why we say lipolysis, because we're using fatty acids. So when glucose is not available, and remember glucose is the primary fuel for the body in cellular respiration, there are alternative sources, and these are the fatty acids we'll talk about. So sometimes even when glucose is available, but there is stress or you just need more energy than the glucose is given to you, then lipolysis can also take place. So in response to low glucose levels or stress, there's this tissue that's called adipose tissue, and I'll show you a picture of that. It'll break down triglycerides, and you may have heard about triglycerides. The triglycerides are turned into fatty acids. And there's these certain hormones, glucagon, which you may be familiar with cellular respiration, and epinephrine, which you may be familiar as adrenaline. So glucagon and epinephrine. We'll talk about that in the video. So here we see a picture of your arteries. Well, not your arteries, but arteries in sense. And you see the triglycerides. Let's get my pen going there. Right here. And of course, these are the red blood cells. So you see RBCs. So basically, triglycerides are a type of stored fat. So we'll say a type of stored fat. Now, elevated triglyceride levels are not good for the body. They could contribute to hardening the arteries, as you can see in this picture over here. They can contribute to heart disease and insulin resistance. And again, this is not a health video, so check with your doctor if you have high triglyceride levels. But triglycerides will circulate in the blood in the form of a lipoprotein. So these things here, those aren't the triglycerides. The triglycerides are inside these things called lipoproteins. The lipoproteins. And I'll show you a picture of that. They're also, triglycerides are free flowing. They'll flow in the blood, but they're also stored in adipose tissue. So let me show you a picture of that also. So as you can see from the picture, there's the adipose tissue. It's a connective fat tissue, and its primary function is to store energy. That stores the triglycerides. So if the body requires energy, triglycerides can be broken down through lipolysis, which we're talking about in this video. Again, sometimes you do have enough glucose in your body through cellular respiration happening, but again, the body may go through forms of stress, and maybe it needs an increased energy demand that glucose is not given. And it also will be, the triglycerides will also be released into fatty acids. Which brings up the next phase, fatty acid oxidation. So let's get my pen working here. And before we talk about fatty acid oxidation, here's the lipoprotein, by the way. You can see the triglycerides are stored in this lipoprotein. So let me write down fatty acid oxidation. Just to review so far now, we know that if the body needs extra energy in the form of fat, because triglycerides will be turned into fatty acids. So the free fatty acids will enter the cell through passive transport. They'll diffuse through the lipid bilayer of the cell membrane. And there's also these fatty acid transporters, which are just proteins, and we'll go over that. So thing to remember with cellular respiration is when you are consuming glucose, when glucose enters the cell, of course, glucose needs insulin, which is released by the pancreas. But when we're talking about lipolysis here, there is no insulin needed. So just going a step back for a minute, Once these triglycerides are turned into fatty acids, they're going to bind themselves to a protein called albumin. Let's write that down. Come back to the fatty acid oxidation, but I'll write down albumin. Albumin. And this is just a fatty acid that will, this is a protein, I should say, where fatty acids will bind to. And then once they get to the tissues, once they get to the cells, they'll be released from albumin, and then they can enter into the cell, and that's where we have fatty acid oxidation. Now, like I said before, fatty acids will enter the cell through specific transport proteins. They don't need insulin. Insulin's with glucose only. So they'll enter the cell. They'll either diffuse in through the lipid membrane, the cell membrane, or they will use these fatty acid transporters. And once in the cell, these fatty acids can be activated and they'll turn into other substances. So we'll talk about that. So there's something called acetyl-CoA. I'll write that down. Acetyl-CoA. You may be familiar with acetyl-CoA. Acetyl-CoA is in glucose, in cellular respiration, when glucose turns into pyruvate and into acetyl-CoA. But with fatty acids, it'll be active. The fatty acids will turn into acetyl-CoA. No T involved. Acetyl-CoA. And again, then this will enter the mitochondria, because the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. So at the end result will be ATP, whether it's glucose, using glucose as the fuel source, or using fatty acids. The thing about glucose is it's much more efficient and it's quicker, and that's why the body prefers it. But if we were using fatty acids, if we have to, well, let's just look about what happens with glucose. If we're doing a comparison here, we'll do a little comparison. Glucose is much more efficient, and it will yield about 30 to 32 adenosine ATP, adenosine triphosphate molecules. But with fatty acids, you get much more ATP, but it takes much longer. It's not as efficient. You can get somewhere to about 106 adenosine triphosphate molecules, ATP. So lipolysis can yield more energy, but it's a longer process and not as efficient. Again, it is an alternative fuel source if there's very low glucose levels or if the body's in stress mode. All right, that's our video today.